What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and Grotsmas is finally over. We have all of the new Grotsmas detachment content drops out available for play in Warhammer 40k. What we're going to be doing today is reviewing all of these detachments against one another in a classic format, a tier maker tier list. I have broken down the tier list into 5 categories: great, good, all right, meh, and absolute trash. These are basically gonna rate the viability of each in context with its faction. It is important to note that I'm not reviewing these in a vacuum. Each detachment works differently depending on the faction that it's built for. So some detachments that might have what look on paper to be good mechanical benefits maybe don't synergize with their faction quite well enough. It's also important to note that this tier list is going to be for the detachments themselves, not the factions that they are placed into. So some detachments might rate more highly than others, despite the fact that the faction that they're slotting into is worse than another one that detachment might have been rated more highly than. Now, for these 5 categories, great are going to be detachments that are, in my opinion, going to immediately enter competitive play. These are likely going to define the faction moving on through at least the next season or so, and be one of the staple detachment options for that faction. Good detachments are a solid option when compared to the other detachments in their faction, and in some cases may end up beating out those detachments, but probably not to as wholesale a level as the level above it. All right and meh detachments are just okay. You can play them if you want, but they are varying levels of just fine. And detachments in the trash tier have basically no reason to be played over their already existing detachments. So with that, let's dive in, and we're starting pretty strong with the Tau Auxiliary Cadre. Now, I'm super high on the Auxiliary Cadre. I think this detachment is absolutely incredible. It has some ridiculously powerful offensive bonuses for Tau and their auxiliary units. Things like having an almost army-wide +1 AP bonus is going to be huge, especially given that Space Marines are going to be super popular moving on for the next couple of months. So having huge AP bonuses to punch through that power armor is going to be enormous. They also have some ridiculous effects. Things like the ability to fall back at the end of either player's fight phase is nuts. That allows this detachment to be incredibly aggressive and also have a ton of repositioning and be able to score very effectively. I think that there is argument for play of the other detachments like Montka and Kauyan within the Tau faction, so I don't know if I'm ready to put Auxiliary Cadre in the great tier, although I think it is that level of power, but I do think that it is probably going to be one of the most commonly played detachments in Tau, if not the only one. Black Spear Task Force is the next one. This one was actually just a basically re-release of the Deathwatch mechanics from the Index. However, we got a ton of support for new kill team datasheets as well as updates to those kill team datasheets in this Grotsmas drop. Deathwatch got a whole new index that they're able to play with, and Black Sphere Task Force is the best way to play Deathwatch in my opinion. Now, that being the case, I do think that it focuses very highly on those kill teams, and while it can make them more maneuverable by giving them assault and teleporting them around the table, in comparison to other Space Marine lists, those Deathwatch kill teams I do think end up feeling a little clunky, even if they do have some absolutely incredible power. I'm going to put Black Sphere Task Force in this good category here. It has the greatest support for kill teams, basically hands down, out of any of the standard Space Marine detachments. If you want to play Deathwatch, it's basically the only way to play them. I don't know if Deathwatch are necessarily going to be the strongest Space Marine sub-faction, but Black Sphere Task Force is definitely a pretty good place to be if you are in Deathwatch. Final Day is the next one. This is the Genestealer Cult detachment that focuses on both Tyranids and Genestealer Cult units together. We're going to windmill slam this right up into the great tier. Genestealer Cults, after their many updates, actually have a bunch of pretty solid detachments, but Final Day looks to be one of the better ones. Getting a pretty easy +1 to hit for most of your army is especially valuable in Genestealer Cults because they tend to be a relatively low ballistic skill army, but being able to do that off of super fast Tyranid units that are good in and of themselves, getting access to gargoyles and other aggressive units like that is not something that any faction is unhappy about, and then those gargoyles also giving your army buffs is absolutely enormous. You can run them up into your opponent's face, screen with them, steal objectives, complete secondaries, and then also make you better at killing your opponent. Hugely powerful detachment, especially given the fact that Genestealer Cult in the December update just got some now much more reliable cult ambush mechanics. I do think that there's going to be a wider variety of lists that they're able to play, especially if we focus on really infantry heavy lists that are able to pretty reliably recur those infantry, and those are also pretty synergistic with this Final Day detachment. Moving on from that, we have Haloscreed Battle Clade. This one also, I think we're throwing up into the great tier as well here. This is huge for Adeptus Mechanicus. Adeptus Mechanicus has kind of had a rough time of it when it comes to their detachments. Some of them are pretty good, but a lot of competitive AdMech play has basically boiled down to just playing Skitarii Hunter cohort, gritting your teeth and white knuckling through it. And Haloscreed Battleclad gives you some other ways to play the faction. It supports the heavier units, things like Scorpius Disintegrators and Onager Dune Crawlers. It also supports the light stuff. So if you want to play Taraxi and you want to play Rust Stalkers, it's huge for them. It's a hugely flexible detachment, and it's got some real power to it as well. Giving Adeptus Mechanicus access to a limited amount of rerolls is pretty solid, and the incredible speed you can get out of this detachment is also really useful. Haloscreed is probably going to slot into the top competitive place for Adeptus Mechanicus. Whether or not it beats out Skitarii Hunter cohort or even some of the other detachments that we're seeing play a little bit, things like Radzone cohort, is an open question, but I do think it's positioned to do that just fine. Next up, we have Reaper's Wager. This one's tough to verify because this is a super weird and unique detachment focusing on a combination of Drukhari and Harlequins and giving buffs to both of them if you are able to build your army in such a way that you can have them lose the Reaper's Wager at opportune times to then inspire them to get rerolls to then win the wager in the future. I'm going to put this one in the all right tier. I definitely think that a good player has the capacity to unlock this detachment with a very specific combination of units. I don't know what that is quite yet. I think that's up for the Drukhari community to figure out, but I know that there are some incredibly skilled Drukhari players who are excited about this detachment and are excited to give it a go. I do think that it is going to be very difficult to play, however, so you do have to be very good at your attack sequencing and making sure you are performing your attacks at the right times in order to ensure that the Reaper's Wager switches over. You also have to build your list in a particular way, focusing guns or melee on one side of the faction or the other in order to make the most use out of the rerolls that you get from that detachment ability. Still a super cool detachment, and it has some incredibly powerful stratagems, but again, it is already in a difficult to play faction and is adding some additional mechanical complexity to that faction. Next up, we have Blood Legion. I'm actually going to put them somewhere around Reaper's Wager, I think, in this all right tier. Blood Legion, to me, seems totally fine. I think its reactive movement effects are super strong, but there is some counterplay to them. So good players are going to be able to counter the Blood Legion pretty effectively. Being a Chaos Demon army in general, and in more specific, a Khorne Demon focused detachment as well, it has very limited support for ranged attackers. Even things like Demonic Incursion, the Index Demon detachment, can teleport the ranged attackers around the table and protect them with Bellicor. Blood Legion doesn't really have that amount of maneuverability. It's basically just setting up 9 inches away from you and making charges, which is totally fine because it does have a lot of buffs to those charges. But if your opponent is effective at screening you out and is able to make sure that you can't get your big punchy melee stuff into combat, into a position where you can use your reactive movements to mess them up, this army's going to fall apart pretty quickly. There may be some play with some allied units in there. You can take some Chaos Knights to add a little bit of ranged punch, and you can keep taking Bellicor in any of the demon detachments in order to protect the army on turn 1 or as it's moving up the table, although he is probably pretty expensive outside of Demonic Incursion. Losing the maneuverability of Demonic Incursion is a huge downside, but obviously it brings a lot of benefits itself, so it's not all bad for the old core demons. Next up, we have the Veiled Blade Assassination Force. We are going to put this one down in the trash tier. This one, I think is kind of poorly executed. A detachment that allowed you to take multiple assassins, I think would be pretty cool, but that is not what Veiled Blade is. Instead, it's a detachment that gives you additional bonuses for your assassins at the cost of points for including them. And those quote-unquote enhancements are not particularly exciting or strong to begin with. They just make your already expensive assassins even more expensive. They muck up with their ability to replace themselves inside agents of the Imperium armies, and all of the stratagems in the detachment are keyed off of being an assassin unit. They have a lesser effect if you use them on anything else, but you're still only allowed to take 4 assassins in the army, so you're only going to be using the most effective version of the stratagems on a couple of units. Not to mention the fact that most of the stratagems in the detachment exist elsewhere as stronger versions, but don't have the same keyword restrictions that they do in Veiled Blade here. I was kind of excited for an assassin detachment, but unfortunately I think this one didn't quite stick the landing. Champions of Faith is the next one. This was the Secresant focused Adeptus Sororitas detachment. We talked about this one extensively on a live stream, and I think one of the problems with Champions of Faith is that it probably would have looked better as a detachment if it had released before the latest December update. Unfortunately, the December update has widely restricted the amount of miracle dice that the Adeptus Sororitas faction has, and Champions of Faith basically wants to just be dumping miracle dice onto units to give them minor statistical buffs, which is really not that exciting. It does make Celestian Sacrosants pretty good, and for that I do think that it's probably going to end up in the meh tier over here, but I don't know if anyone is particularly excited about playing this one over one of Sororitas's other detachments. Even Army of Faith does a kind of similar thing, but a little bit more reliably. Bridgehead Strike is the next one. This is the Astra Militarum detachment focused on drop troopers and deep striking. This one looks absolutely great, and I think we are going to put it in the great tier, probably behind these other detachments. I don't think it beats out Combined Regiment as much as the other detachments in here, but I do think that Bridgehead Strike is looking incredibly strong. Gives you that wound bonus when your unit's set up on the table and has a ton of synergies for your deep striking and transport mounted infantry. That's already a really strong archetype for Astra Militarum in Combined Regiment, and it's just getting additional bonuses for playing it in Bridgehead Strike. So I think this one's going to look really good. It's also an interesting way to play the army differently than the standard Lord Solar Leontis led tank company Combined Regiment list that has a bit of a sub-focus on some of the jump infantry. So if you want to play a more infantry focused or mechanized infantry focused variety of that list, you can slot it into Bridgehead Strike just fine. Especially given the fact that Militarum tank commanders now order themselves and don't really require any support to be effective. This detachment can still play a contingent of armored units and then also take just a ton of drop in infantry or mechanized infantry to make use of the detachment benefits, and I think a list like that is going to be really strong. We're just keeping going strong here. Creations of Bile is this melee focused, obviously Fabius Bile themed detachment for Chaos Space Marines. We are going to slam this one up into the great tier. I think this detachment is absolutely awesome. Chaos Space Marine units tend to be okay in melee, but have really mediocre stats that they kind of rely on Dark Pacts to shore up. And Creations of Bile just gives you the benefits to pump those melee stats up from being okay to being really good, and then also benefiting from your Dark Pact and your other faction synergies. This detachment is going to take the relatively mid-tier combat units that Chaos Space Marines have, like Chosen or Possessed, and push them absolutely through the roof. It's going to allow you to play really aggressive, high-scoring varieties, and we've literally already seen it win a GT so far, almost immediately after being released. I think this detachment has the potential to overcome all the other detachments in the Chaos Space Marine faction and become the most popular one there, and I also think that it just has some super powerful mechanics built into it, even in comparison to the other Chaos Space Marine detachments. Hearthband is the next one, and unfortunately this is another one that we're going to throw down in the trash tier here. This just doesn't feel like a detachment that was particularly well designed with Leagues of Votann in mind. Votann is so focused on its judgment token mechanic. All of its weapons are depowered because they are mathed with the assumption that you'll have judgment tokens active on your opponent's unit. So giving them a detachment that does not generate any judgment tokens itself is a recipe for disaster. In comparison to Oathband, the other detachment, the index detachment for the faction, this one looks horrible. Now that feels weird because there are a bunch of really powerful mechanical buffs inside the faction. You can get AP bonuses, you can get rerolls, you can get extra attacks, but the problem is that the weapon profiles that you're buffing are depowered because they are meant to have judgment tokens active, and the detachment is focused on very aggressive infantry. It's trying to force you to teleport things like Einhir Hearthguard into your opponent's face and get a bunch of bonuses on them and do damage, which means that most of the time those units that you're attacking will not have attacked already, so they will not have judgment tokens to begin with. It just doesn't feel like a detachment that was written for the current version of Leagues of Votann. Maybe that changes in the future if the faction is rewritten and the judgment token mechanic is reworked, but as it stands right now for Index Votann, this is not a good detachment, which is weird to say because it does feel like a detachment that in other factions would be really strong, but unfortunately just doesn't synergize very well with the faction. The same is not true for our next one, however. Warpbane Task Force is another one that we are going to throw into the great tier up here, especially given the fact that we saw some minor nerfs to Teleport Strike Force in the form of things like their 3-inch Deep Strike being removed in the Data Slate update, and also seeing things like their Armor of Contempt True Silver Armor getting nerfed as well. Warpbane Task Force just looks like the best way to play Grey Knights right now. It also makes your Grey Knight units way more reliable. You have almost permanent hit rerolls active throughout most of the table for this army, and it's able to push units like Purifiers absolutely through the roof in terms of their damage output. You're still fighting with a lot of mediocre profiles, which is kind of what Grey Knights bring to the table, but it definitely has a ton of buffs for those profiles that can push them into the realm of being actually pretty solid. I played this one on stream and I had an absolute blast. It felt so powerful. Being able to get close deep strikes and charge out of them and getting hit rerolls and things like Nemesis Dread Knights was huge, and it allowed you to play a little bit more combined arms than the Teleport Strike Force typically built. Teleport Strike Force was very often either all Nemesis Dread Knights or all Terminators, and this detachment feels like you have to take a variety of infantry and Nemesis Dread Knights in order to play it effectively, and if you do build that army effectively, it is super powerful. Very high on Warpbane Task Force, and I definitely think that it's going to be transformative to the Grey Knights faction. Next up, we have Solar Spearhead for Adeptus Custodes. Now, I'm pretty high on Solar Spearhead. I think we're going to put this one up in the good tier here. I don't think it's quite to the same level as something like Auxiliary Cadre, so it's going to be down towards the end of this tier, but it's definitely a really good way to play Custodes. It gives you a lot more board control than Custodes typically have. Oftentimes, Custodes units just have to run into the center of the table and hope for the best, but given the fact that Solar Spearhead can now use large dreadnoughts or mounted unit bricks that have a naturally long threat range, stage them in the center of the table, and then punch through walls to then get to the able to project threat ranges a lot longer if they're not quite as consistent as units like Custodian Guard or Wardens. I don't think that the all Dreadnought variety of this detachment is quite the way to go. I think there's a happy medium between Virtus Praetors, Telemon Heavy Dreadnoughts, and Infantry, as well as Caladius Graph Tanks that's also solid, but there are some pretty strong benefits for other unit types in there as well. Things like Anathema Psychona Rhinos getting the OC buff and being able to repair themselves back into that OC buff is pretty solid. Not to mention the fact that any of your shooting tanks will be slightly more effective in a shootout with other tanks, unlocking rerolls for themselves as soon as they take any damage. Even just slotting a Telemon Dreadnought and maybe a couple of Virtus Praetors into a standard-looking Custodes army makes it a pretty solid Solar Spearhead army, and while I'm not 100% sure that it's going to beat out something like Talons of the Emperor or Shield Host for competitive viability, I do think that it at least offers a really viable alternative to those detachments. Flyblown Host is the next one. We're going to put this one in the meh tier. This is basically a more defensive variety of Death Guard versus the more offensive version brought by Plague Company. Unfortunately for Flyblown Host, I'm not 100% sure that the defensive characteristics of Death Guard Terminators are quite good enough to support a detachment like this. They get permanent stealth from the detachment ability, which is good, as well as the ability to get some -1 to wound effects. And you can also stack that with some internal synergies. Things like Demon Princes to give them some buffs as well can make a Terminator army pretty viable. And I do think that this detachment is fairly good, but I'm not sure that it wins out in comparison to Plague Company, since Plague Company is able to basically ape a lot of those same effects by reducing enemy weapon skill, for example, in addition to also having the capacity to buff their damage and getting things like locking objectives. I'm definitely willing to be proven wrong with Flyblown Host. I think that a good player could make a super aggressive, defensive, Terminator-focused army work with this detachment, but I think I'll have to see it played because right now it doesn't look quite as strong as the standard index detachment for the faction. Now, while I'm not 100% sure on Flyblown Host, Hexwarp Thrallband is the next one, and this one I'm definitely sure on. This is a real trash detachment that we're going to put into the trash tier down here. Thrallband is in kind of a similar place to the detachment right next to it, Hearthband, because while on paper the detachment effects look like they might be pretty good, the issue is that they are really anti-synergistic with Thousand Suns mechanic. The comparison to Cult of Magic, the index detachment for Thousand Suns, is not great, especially given the fact that Cult of Magic is probably one of the better detachments printed in 40k right now, and replacing basically army-wide devastating wounds with something like a situational +1 to wound is not quite that exciting, especially given that Magnus Thread can just unlock your +1 to wound already. The detachment only affects your psychic attacks, and I think that there probably would be a greater argument for it if it was open to other styles of attack, but unfortunately that kind of forces Thousand Suns into trying to play sorcerers to benefit from the detachment ability, who would have been better served by just playing Cult of Magic. It also grants you situational wound rerolls, which most of your units will already get thanks thanks to attached rubric marines. And in order to unlock its +1 to wound, it requires you to check objective control, which is done at the end of phases, which means that if you use temporal surge to take objectives, it actually doesn't affect your flow of magic at all. There's a bunch of internal anti-synergies inside this detachment, which make it really awkward, and on the whole, it's just strictly worse than Cult of Magic. So there's really very little reason to play this. Next up is Angelic Inheritors, the character-focused Blood Angels detachment. This is a little bit of another example of comparison with the other detachments being kind of damning for these ones. Angelic Inheritors is, I would say, an okay detachment. It gives you army-wide rerolls on your characters, or other buffs if you want them, and has some pretty solid stratagems. Things like Lone Operative effect, as well as stratagems that are pumped up if you target a character unit with them, are all pretty good. With that, however, I think I will put this in the meh tier over here. It does lack a lot of tools that other Blood Angels detachments tend to rely on. Things like the ability to advance and charge is just entirely missing from this detachment, which is unfortunate when compared to literally all of the other Blood Angels detachments that all have a stratagem like that inside them. This means that there's really very little reason to play Angelic Inheritors, and while it does make a cool solo character focus list maybe slightly more viable, the fact that most of your army is going to be fairly slow compared to other versions of the faction doesn't make it particularly appetizing. Now, speaking of appetite, our next detachment is going to be the Warrior Bioform Onslaught from Tyranids. This is another super weird one, because it basically totally redefines how Tyranids are able to be played, focusing on what is basically a heavy infantry spam style of army that the faction didn't really have access to outside of some weird assimilation swarm builds that probably didn't really work that well to begin with. Instead, Warrior Bioform Onslaught gives you huge benefits to things like ranged bioweapon warriors and allows them to be spammed in large numbers, being relatively difficult to kill, especially for their point cost. I think I'm going to put this one up here in the good tier. We've already seen some success from Warrior Bioform Onslaught, basically just using the stratagems in the detachment to buff Tyranid shooting, not even really using its synergy with warriors, but I do think that at the very least it adds a totally new line of play to Tyranids and allows them to play this kind of heavy infantry spam variety that they didn't really have access to before. Whether or not it beats out other Tyranid detachments that are more proven, things like Invasion Fleet or Vanguard Onslaught, remains to be seen, but I think at the very least it adds a really viable alternative to those detachments that's probably somewhere similar in terms of power level. Now we're going to stay in this tier for a little while here because the next one up is Librarius Conclave for Space Marines. This is the librarian focused detachment, and I think this one also ends up here in the good tier. Now, I don't think that Librarius Conclave really wins out ahead of any of the other super strong Space Marine detachments. Stuff that is very straightforward and has a lot of flexibility built in, like Gladius Task Force or Vanguard Spearhead, or even in some cases Ironstorm Spearhead, are incredibly strong for the faction, and I don't know if Librarius Conclave comes to quite that level, but I do think that it is at the very least a viable alternative to those detachments. The downside for this detachment, in my opinion, is that it focuses so heavily on librarian characters, and while it has a lot of super cool support for those characters, it means that the other units in your army that aren't being led by librarians have essentially no synergy with the detachment whatsoever. So you're spending a bunch of points on taking some of the least powerful characters in the faction in order to buff your units to make those units slightly better than other detachments have as army-wide buffs. Well, there are a couple units in this detachment that are absolutely incredibly powerful. Fusillade, for example, is the big enhancement for Librarius Conclave and makes one of its units of Sternguard veterans probably absolutely lethal against a wide variety of targets. But the question remains whether having one big powerful unit like that is stronger than having an army of slightly less powerful units like you would have in other detachments. Now, all that being said, I don't think that makes it Librarius Conclave bad, and I do think the buffs that it has for those units are very strong, which makes it, at the very least, a viable alternative, at least competitively, to the other very popular detachments in the Space Marine faction. Now, the next one we have to talk about is another super strong detachment for Chaos Demons. This is the Legion of Excess. We're going to slot this one right up here into the good tier because, like Tau Auxiliary Conclave, that it's going to be sitting next to, I do think that Legion of Excess adds a hugely powerful detachment to the Chaos Demons faction. This detachment makes Slaanesh units that are already fairly well statted for their cost absolutely lethal. And while it is much more straightforward than a detachment like Demonic Incursion that might have some additional benefits for maneuverability, the fact that Legion of Excess can put some hugely powerful units like Keepers of Secrets just on the line, move them through walls, and give them huge benefits when attacking large targets that they have traditionally struggled to kill, gives this detachment a lot of raw power. And all that constructs the image of a very aggressive and very powerful army. The open question is whether or not that allows demons to beat some of their really tough matches, and I definitely think that there are still reasons to play Demonic Incursion or some of the other detachments if you want to. I don't think Legion of Excess necessarily invalidates those other detachments, but I do think that it is on paper the most powerful looking detachment in the codex right now. Now we're going to get a little bit of a case of whiplash here with Champions of Fenris being our next detachment, and this one is going to go into the bottom of the trash tier. This might be a controversial opinion, but I think that Champions of Fenris might be the worst detachment in Warhammer 40,000. I'm sure that there are maybe some other examples of really, really bad detachments that will take the cake, and maybe it's a recency bias given the fact that it was just released, but I think Champions of Fenris might be it. This is the Space Wolves detachment that gives you access to basically the old Space Wolf heroic intervention mechanics. They can now, quote-unquote, heroically intervene with their whole army against enemies within 3 inches of them. Unfortunately, as a detachment ability that has some expert counterplay by simply not standing within 3 inches of them, which, generally speaking, is not very difficult to do in a game of Warhammer 40,000. Compound that with an almost useless list of stratagems. It has like a sustained hits or lethal hit stratagem, which I think is really the only exciting one out of the selection, and Champions of Fenris just doesn't really give you any benefits whatsoever for playing it. I think that most Champions of Fenris lists would be better served by playing literally any other Space Marine detachment, even ones that didn't really have any explicit synergy with the units that you're taking. The real pièce de résistance to this dumpster fire of a stratagem is their redeployment that they have for Terminator units, except that it's not Terminator unit, it's literally only Terminator squads, which is the unit with the Stormbolters. It's a Space Wolf Terminator detachment whose #1 stratagem targeting Terminators does not affect Wolf Guard Terminators, the Space Wolf Terminator unit. This kind of feels like an interaction that was maybe written in very late in the process when the designers realized that a Space Wolves Terminator unit can be basically anything because you can attach Wolf Guard Terminator pack leaders into almost any Space Wolf unit, which would allow the detachment to reposition basically most units in the supplement, which at least would give Champions of Fenris something cool to do and an identity of its own, where your Terminator pack leaders are able to teleport your units around. That's not how the stratagem works, however. It literally only works on the standard Terminator squad, one of the worst datasheets in the entire Space Marine faction. This detachment is hilariously inept. It has absolutely no synergy with even the units that it's trying to get you to take, and a laughably terrible detachment ability. If you ever think that you want to play Champions of Fenris, just play Gladius Task Force instead, and at least one time during the game give yourself Ignore Cover or +1 to Wound in melee for a CP, which is about 10,000 times more synergy than Champions of Fenris would have with your army if you were playing it. Now we're going to continue with this whiplash because the next one is Starshatter Arsenal, one of the strongest detachments that we've seen printed for 40k, and we are going to throw this one at the top of the great tier. Starshatter Arsenal is the, nominally, I guess, vehicle-focused detachment for Necrons, but realistically just has buffs for basically any Necron unit. It gives your vehicle and mounted units assault, but also gives you +1 to hit when targeting enemies on objectives, which is probably roughly 50% of the attacks you'll make over the course of a game. If your opponent decides not to stand on objectives ever, then they'll just lose on primary, so that's totally fine with you. It also has an absolutely insane brace of stratagems, including the ability for your vehicles to move through walls, auto 6 on advance rolls, and +1 to wound when targeting enemies on objectives, in addition to a bunch of super strong defensive stratagems as well. Even given the fact that Necrons Necrons have been a fairly well-performing faction throughout the entirety of 10th edition. This detachment has just so much raw power associated with it that I think it's going to synergize with Necron datasheets incredibly well, and will end up running a ton of Necron archetypes better than the detachments that were purpose-built for those styles of play. Starshatter Arsenal is incredible, and it's going to be coming to a tournament near you pretty soon. And with that, we'll move over to the Ork Tactical Brigade. This is another really interesting one. This is the kind of Militarum themed Ork detachment that gives you a kind of modicum of orders for your Ork units that are issued by war bosses and mechs. It also has a ton of really powerful benefits for utility units like commandos or storm boys, and also can support a more ranged Forkist? Is that? This is a Freudian slip. A Forkian slip. It also can support a more ranged focus variety of orcs than many other detachments can. For this reason, I think that we're going to shoot this one up into the good tier. We'll see if it ends up beating out more melee-oriented varieties of orcs that maybe synergize a little bit better with their strong melee profiles. But I do think that given a lot of the very strong datasheets that orcs have received most recently, things like the new Tank Busters unit that can give orc armies a really strong ranged anti-tank option, especially given that the detachment already has some pretty strong ranged attacks with the return of Captain Badrock through the Mech Captain enhancement. This is going to allow you to play a really strong combined arms variety of orcs. Other orc varieties that are more focused on melee have already seen success post the December update. We'll see if they continue to do so, and we'll also see if Tactical Brigade can bring the faction into a little bit more well-rounded of a game plan. Next up, we have Questor Forge Pact, and we are going to put this one, unfortunately, down in the trash tier. This detachment has some cool things it's trying to do with Imperial Knights. Giving them access to infantry units out of Adeptus Mechanicus, for example, is pretty sweet, and pretty heavily expands the unit selection available to Imperial Knights. Unfortunately for the Questor Forge Pact, however, it's missing a lot of the synergy that Imperial Knights have really needed in order to succeed so far, especially making its units harder to kill, which is something that you really need to do when you're talking about running 400 plus point units that have a penchant for being targeted down by really strong opposing attacks. Missing things like a built-in feel no pain or their rotate ion shields makes this army very easy to kill, and replacing that with situational regeneration is not that useful when you consider that your opponent has a much greater opportunity to just one-shot your knights in a round of shooting, and then you don't get the opportunity to heal them anyway. Questor Forge Pact is another detachment that really pales in the comparison with the Index detachment for the faction, so there's really very little reason to play them outside of the Noble Lance that we already have in the Knight Index. Lion's Blade is the next one. This is the Dark Angels kind of combined arms focused detachment that has some really cool synergies between Deathwing and Ravenwing units in your army. Dark Angels have a very wide selection of really strong detachments, and even faction-specific things like Company of Hunters is starting to see more and more play as the season goes on. So whether or not Lion's Blade has what it takes to compete with those styles of detachments remains to be seen. However, it does have a lot of really strong buffs for the combination of those units. With that being the case, I think we're going to put this one up in the alright tier here. Well, I don't know if it beats out some of the classic combinations for Dark Angels. I definitely think that it is at the very least going to offer a unique alternative and a way to play both your Ravenwing and your Deathwing units together and buff both of them in cool and interesting ways. Next up, we're going to move on over to World Eaters and talk about the Vessels of Wrath detachment. This is a new character and unit champion-focused detachment that's able to unlock some additional blessings of Khorne for those units. To be honest, Vessels of Wrath feels like mostly a side grade from Berserker Warband, the Index detachment for World Eaters. While this detachment has much less synergy with Angron, and if you want to play Angron-less World Eaters, it's probably the way to go. I do think that armies using Vessels of Wrath are going to look and operate very similarly to just regular Berserker Warband armies. However, the ability to unlock additional blessings of Khorne for specific units gives it a lot more flexibility than you would get out of Berserker Warband. So you're trading some additional damage for more modality, and I think that's pretty solid. I think we're going to put this one in the alright tier. I think that it is just a perfectly fine alternative to Berserker Warband. You can probably play either one of them and play probably a similar selection of units, and you'll simply be a little bit more flexible versus getting extra strength in attacks. And that moves us down to Chaos Knights with Iconoclast Fiefdom. This is a really interesting and cool detachment, but I think that it probably mostly stops there. This gives you access to Chaos Cultist units in your Chaos Knights army. It allows you to essentially kill the Cultists in your army to Dark Pact for your Chaos Knight. The detachment also has some other cool synergies, like the ability to advance and charge with Chaos Knights, or to reactive move with those Cultist units to muck up your opponent's plans. But unfortunately, Iconoclast Feistum has a little bit of the same problem as Questor Forge Pack for Imperial Knights, where the faction is kind of built around having access to specific stratagems, in this case uniquely Knights of Shade to allow its especially War Dog units to move through solid structures, and allows the faction a lot of maneuverability, and this detachment doesn't have any analog for that. I do think that's totally fine and you're okay playing it. I'm going to put it up in the meh tier over here because it does have some cool things that you can do, like improve the offensive output of your knights by sacrificing your cultists, and obviously it is an incredibly fluffy detachment, but I do think that its viability mostly stops there. Now, speaking of non-viable stuff, let's talk about Armored Warhost for Aeldari. This is another one that we're going to slam down here into the trash tier, probably somewhere around Questor Forge Pact. This detachment for Eldar has some really cool things going on. It's trying to make you play a transport and vehicle focused variety of Eldar, but unfortunately that's just an archetype that's better served by playing Battle Host and getting a bunch of rerolls on all your attacks forever. While it does have ways to buff your units offensively, it has very little ways to reinforce them defensively, which is unfortunate given the fact that Eldar vehicles tend to be some of the squishiest in the entire game. They're super fast and maneuverable, but they don't really stand up to a straight up fight. So if you're trying to play them aggressively and get them into your opponent's face, not only are you doing less damage than you would be if you were playing Battle Host, you also have very few defensive mechanics. So losing things like Fire and Fade to run them away, or lightning fast reactions to give you -1 to be hit are all gone. And so you're going to be taking more damage than you would be in a different detachment for the same faction. Given the fact that Eldar are staring down the barrel of a brand new codex, this detachment kind of feels like it was maybe written for a variety of Eldar that maybe don't have access to the same power of Battle Host. Probably one of the best printed detachments in 40k, at least with the best printed detachment ability. And so at the time of recording, Armored Warhost looks absolutely pathetic in comparison. I think that we may see new datasheets and new faction abilities that will make this detachment make a lot more sense in the future. At least I'm hoping so, because otherwise we've basically just wasted all our time with this thing. Now with that, we also have Plague Legion. This is the Nurgle focused detachment for Chaos Demons. I think we're going to put this one down in the meh tier as well, probably somewhere around Angelic Inheritors. This is a cool detachment. It has a theme of battle shock surrounding the whole thing, and is able to compound with the Shadow of Chaos army effect that Chaos Demons already have to do extra mortal wounds to the opponent's army by forcing a bunch of additional battle shock checks. That's really cool. Is it good? Probably less so. Forcing battle shock checks on your opponent has never been a particularly reliable strategy in 10th edition 40k, and while Chaos Demons do have some of the best benefits for it, it requires that you protrude your Shadow of Chaos into those areas, which also, generally speaking, requires that you survive. Nurgle Demon units are very difficult to kill per point, but unfortunately they still go down fairly quickly. One of the downside of all these god-specific Chaos Demons detachments is that they're lacking the enhancements from Demonic Incursion, which had specific enhancements for each Chaos God. The one for Nurgle was one of the best enhancements in the entire game, a 4+ Feel No Pain, which you could put on something like a Great Unclean One to give yourself a huge defensive bulwark in the center of the table, which you don't have access to in Plague Legion, so your Great Unclean Ones are probably going to die pretty quickly. Compounding that with the fact that Nurgle Chaos Demons don't tend to be super high damage output, you have an army that's relatively slow, of kind of middling survivability and mediocre damage output, that's really relying on its battle shock shenanigans to inflict casualties, and which isn't generally a very good place to be. I don't necessarily think that this is a wholesale bad detachment, but it definitely feels like one that maybe doesn't synergize with the Nurgle Chaos Demons quite as well as Demonic Incursion does. At least in that detachment, we have ways to teleport graded clean ones around the table and buff their survivability, and in this one, we're lacking both of those, which makes it kind of unappetizing to play. Although for Nurgle Chaos Demons, that might be kind of the point. That's thematically appropriate. And with that, we'll move on to Black Templars and their Wrathful Procession. This is a detachment that's kind of nominally trying to get players to play into a more horde-focused variety. However, otherwise, I think it has better synergy with things like mounted units almost. This detachment, I think, is totally fine. It's kind of a side grade from something a little bit more straightforward, like Righteous Crusaders, the Index detachment for Black Templars, or Gladius Task Force, but it offers you some unique abilities. You have the ability, for example, to start of the battle round to improve the movement characteristics of your army, which is pretty good, especially when you have the ability to advance and charge like Grimaldus does, and it enhances those large units by allowing them to attack en masse with relentless momentum, which is a totally unique mechanic that we haven't seen anywhere else. There's certainly arguments to play this detachment over others available to Black Templars, but it seems to me at the very best to be kind of a side grade. I think we're going to put this one in the all right tier. I don't know if it necessarily feels quite as good as those more straightforward detachments, but it definitely gives you something to play with, and you can play a big brick of Primaris Crusaders or two and get that real Horde mode theme from Black Templars without feeling bad about it, because the detachment does support them okay. And with that, we have the Scintillating Legion as our final detachment. This is an interesting one because I think it's mechanically extremely unique, probably one of the most mechanically unique and complex detachments that we've seen, at least recently released for the game, which has gotten a lot of players really excited about it, but in my opinion, it's not all that particularly competitive. It gives you an interesting flux token mechanic, which allows you to trade rerolls with your opponent, either by rerolling your dice yourself or by empowering your stratagems with the flux tokens. However, it gives your opponent a lot of control over your flux token economy. Each time you spend flux tokens, you will pass them to your opponent, and your opponent can spend them to pass them back. If they end up having flux tokens remaining in their pool, then the Tzeentch player will continuously generate flux tokens over the course of the game, which is mostly going to happen because the detachment allows you to spend flux tokens at the end of your opponent's turn to then give yourself the capacity to generate more. However, there's no requirement that your opponent actually spends them, so they can actually just hold on to them to basically neutralize your detachment ability down to getting a reroll like once a turn maybe, which is on the whole not a very strong detachment ability. Other than that, the detachment's mostly focused on a bunch of pretty cool enhancements. It does have the ability to pick up for 1 flux token and a CP up to 2 units, which can pull out of engagement range, which is cool. However, one thing that I think a lot of players forget is that Demonic Incursion can also just do that. It can't pick up out of engagement range, but it can pick up 2 units as long as they're both in Shadow of Chaos. And Demonic Incursion also gives you enhanced ways to bring those units back on the table, in addition to having the Everstave, probably the best enhancement for a Lord of Change, over essentially everything inside Scintillating Legion, besides maybe the Puppet Master enhancement, which essentially makes Scintillating Legion an almost strictly worse version of Demonic Incursion that simply trades better deep strikes and higher strength Lord of Change attacks for having rerolls sometimes. In that, I think I'm going to put this one in the meh tier somewhere over here. It's not a one-to-one comparison, and I don't think Scintillating Legion is a bad detachment. It's definitely going to feel like it's doing things over the course of the game. I think that generally speaking, you're going to be better served by just playing Demonic Incursion, a much more straightforward detachment than Scintillating Legion is. I guess it is appropriate that the Tzeentch detachment is incredibly complex. For generally speaking, not too much benefit, but that is an unfortunate place for it to be. And with that, that is my tier list for all of the Grotsmith detachments. Let me know down in the comment section if you agree or disagree with this tier list or any of the takes that I've had so far. I'm excited to see how these detachments evolve as we move on into the future, and if there are any updates to them after this video releases. So with that, thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.